You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network. This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week we're joined by Abby Thorne-Lyman, former director of real estate at BART, to talk about BART's development projects and priorities and the importance of real estate to BART's future. Stay with us. Today's podcast was produced in partnership with Impact, formerly Railvolution. For a deeper dive on livability issues or to check out the 2023 Impact Transit and Mobility Conference in Phoenix, Arizona, visit impactmobility.org, mpactmobility.org. Today's podcast is brought to you by our wonderful, amazing Patreon supporters. Your support is critical to Talking Headways and Mondays at the Overhead Wire. We really appreciate it. To join this gang of zoning misfits and transportation rabble-rousers, go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. $2 a month gets you some stickers and a handwritten note. $10 a month gets you one of our transportation scarves. Thanks so much to everybody who supports the show, from the bus drivers to the advocates all around the world. That's patreon.com/theoverheadwire. And for more information on our work and where to find our daily newsletter, the transportation scarves, our Cars Are Cholesterol merch, buy books from the authors that join us on the show at our bookshop affiliate site, or find our audiobook version of Raymond Unwin's Town Planning and Practice, check out the show notes on your podcatcher or visit theoverheadwire.com. The weather is changing as we head towards winter, and you know what that means. It's gonna get cold. And scarf weather is here. We've got red bus scarves and green bike scarves, so pick one up to keep you warm on your journey to work or to advocate at a public meeting. These soccer-style scarves can be held up above your head to share your love of bus and bike lanes, and I hope you pick one up for the fall. To get one for you or for a friend, go to theoverheadwire.com and order one today. 5% discount if you order 5 or more. Just send me an email, theoverheadwire@gmail.com, and we can get that set up for you. Otherwise, go to theoverheadwire.com. Well, Abby Thorne-Lyman, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thanks for being here. I guess I should say welcome back to the podcast. You were here on episode 155 of Talking Headways back in ye old times of 2017.
Pre-COVID.
For those who might not be familiar with your work, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I'm currently the Director of Real Estate and Property Development at BART, and I have been at BART for almost 10 years. And I have a background in city and regional planning, and I always knew I wanted to do something around economic development. And then later I kind of figured out real estate, and I used to work with you.
That's true. We did used to work together.
Those were good years. And yeah, made the leap into the public sector in 2013, and I haven't looked back, I guess.
That's good. So I think last time we talked a little bit about like what got you interested in cities, but maybe I should ask you what you were interested in about cities, real estate, transportation, urban planning generally. Like, what are you interested in these days?
What am I interested in these days? Well, I am nearing the end of my tenure at BART and about to switch jobs to be the Base Reuse and Economic Development Director for the city of Alameda. And a lot of my motivation for switching is that I have increasingly realized I would like to work in a city. I love working on the real estate matters, but I also really just love the economic development aspect and all of the non-real property aspects of what it means to help a city thrive. So that's kind of where I see myself headed, is towards that, with, still a strong grounding in real estate development, but also, workforce development. How are we training our workers, addressing the income gap? I think that's just a really fascinating problem that I think has not been as embedded in city planning traditionally as it should have been. Where are the workers going to come from? Who's going to train them? How are they going to get that training? How are they then going to get the jobs they need with that training? So that flow of people just really interests me. So I'm excited to explore that a little bit more in the future.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because I think right now we're seeing just this overwhelming need for public sector workers and training people to take on those jobs as kind of the wave of retirements happens. And even the kind of pandemic kind of accelerated a little bit, but then there's just this gap, I feel like, between the amount of people that are available and the amount of people that are needed for that type of stuff. So that's really interesting. Yeah. So we're here for the Impact podcast. And I was just thinking about this the other day. I was thinking about like my first Impact/Railvolution conference back in Chicago in 2006. And I was wondering like what your first kind of experience was, and maybe how it's different now than then.
I think for years I had heard about Railvolution when we worked together at Reconnecting America, and I just remember how involved Gloria Oland was and how cool Gloria was and how cool Railvolution seemed as a concept of really trying to stay on the cutting edge, do things creatively, incorporate, different kinds of placemaking and public art, and just working at the edge of all of these different fields. And what a cool thing to have a conference about. I'm trying to think, I did not go to Railvolution for many years. I'm trying to think what my first Railvolution was. It might have been LA or Denver, but I think I really dove both feet in when we hosted the conference here in San Francisco, which I think was 2018.
Yeah.
And that was intense. That was intense. It was a great experience. It was a great learning experience. And then that was when I joined the steering committee for Railvolution. And
I just remember some really fun karaoke in Pittsburgh. We had a lot of fun there. And then
we're
here
really
too.
Good. You're really good at karaoke.
No.
And we do good karaoke together too. So.
Well, so you've been working on some iteration of TOD for about 2 decades now. And I'm wondering how you feel about the concept now, maybe how it's evolved a little bit in your mind.
Yeah, I think in general, obviously the field is moving towards transit-oriented communities, not transit-oriented development. And that is super important. Because I sit in this seat where my job is real property and disposition of BART's real property, I am very focused on the TOD aspect of this. Like what I do now is largely focused on the joint development experience and the role that BART can play in catalytic efforts on BART's property exclusively. But we have a huge team at BART, and we have a huge station access team. We have stationary planning. And so I personally am very focused still on that TOD piece, even though a lot of the policy work has moved to the TOC piece. But, BART, when we adopted our new TOD policy in 2016, we jointly adopted a station access policy. So, I think we do see the role that larger area plays and that customer access plays. But here within such a large agency with such a large portfolio of land, there are a lot of different people working on different components of this. We do break it down still into its component parts, but we all are great friends and we get along really well and everything like that. So I still am very focused on the joint development piece. I also feel like that is very important to me because of the regional housing crisis and the critical role that public land can play. And so that is just a problem of, trying to remove the barriers to public land development that I think has been a real focal point for me personally and has been a focal point for the region. A couple of years ago, I participated in the CASA effort that MTC hosted, which was really bringing together housing practitioners from all of the different facets of housing, market rate developers, affordable housing developers, tenants' rights, public agencies. And out came the P3s, the production, preservation, and protection. But one of the 10 core strategies that CASA had settled on was public land. And I think we haven't done enough around that as a state, as a region. And there's always new lessons. And this is where Impact is so helpful, is going into the deep dive on the very technical aspects of doing that real property disposition and really getting in the weeds and letting us practitioners in this tiny, tiny field of transit agency land just get together and nerd it out about the very unique issues that we have.
You talk about other transit agencies and maybe other folks that do this. Do you have any examples of like agencies or groups that you look up to in that respect?
Oh, we all have like a healthy competition going. I would say particularly the West Coast agencies, because we share so many of the same issues in terms of, the deep focus on affordable housing and our crisis. We have a monthly consortium of all of the California transit agencies who do joint development that gets together. So BART and VTA, in particular VTA, they run the portion of BART that goes into the Silicon Valley, and they also have light rail and buses. And Jesse O'Malley-Solis and Ron Golem, who run that program, are very close collaborators of mine, and we are constantly one-upping each other on, who has the more progressive affordable housing policies or who's doing the more interesting thing, and LA Metro as well. We have just a great thought partnership with our fellow agencies. And now one of our former colleagues, Nadine, is in charge at Caltrain. So we don't go far. So all the California transit agencies, I think because we are under the same state laws, we definitely have sort of a mutual partnership and admiration. But, Thatcher at Sound Transit is a close collaborator. And when we get together too, we can just go really nerdy on some of this stuff.
can imagine.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit more about BART. Can you give us a little bit of an overview of kind of what's happened since 2016, since the policy that came out, and maybe what's currently in the development pipeline with BART projects?
Yeah. Some stuff has happened. A few things.
That pandemic thing happened.
Yeah, the pandemic obviously is really core to what's happened at BART. But so when we talked last in that podcast, I was extolling the many benefits of the TOD guidelines we had just published.
Mm-hmm.
And within the year, one of our board members, Nick Josefowitz, championed this effort to bring new state legislation called Assembly Bill 2923 with David Chu, who was an assembly member from San Francisco, and Timothy Grayson, who's an assembly member out in Concord. And this law basically codified that every city that had BART-owned property near a station would have to rezone that property to meet BART's TOD guidelines by 2020. That if they did not do that, then effective in middle of 2022, their property would just be rezoned to meet the guidelines. So that has been a huge deal for us, obviously. And the other thing that it did is, California has been doing a lot of work around streamlining for housing projects that meet certain affordability and labor requirements. And AB 2923 took what the state had done, what Scott Wiener had done in SB 35, it took it one step further and said that those streamlining requirements and streamlining abilities extended to all BART-owned property in 3 counties. So our developers now both have the zoning that they need to do good TOD, and they have the ability to bypass any onerous local review process and get it done in 180 days. So that's been a really big deal for us. It obviously caused a lot of uproar among our partner local jurisdictions that I think just generally have been very angry about stripping of local control, and that these are our cities and we know them best, and what are you doing? And there was other state law that was going through at the time that did not pass, and all of the frustration and anger around that state law was redirected to our legislation that was moving forward. And so we have had to do a lot of deep engagement with our cities to make it clear to them that we are not going to come in and steamroll you and just go build a project without you having a say. And that's just not how we work. There's lots of good reasons that we shouldn't do that. It is really hard to do a project without partnership of a city, even if state law says you can do it. So we ended up creating a TOD work plan where we were able to just articulate to the jurisdictions, these are the stations we intend to develop in the next 5 years, and these are the stations we intend to develop in the next 10 years, and just got much more transparent about where we were headed and why. And here's, if you want to be on this list, here's what you have to do to be on this list. And if you don't want to be on this list, don't worry about it. We have plenty of partners on our dance card. We don't actually need to go fight with a city that doesn't want anything to happen. But the interesting thing was when we went out to talk to, we have 22 jurisdictions with BART land, and we went out to talk to them, we found that there were only 4 jurisdictions that did not want to see any new development on their land. So 18 of the 22, some of them were very angry about the law. They were angry about the principle of the law. They absolutely wanted to see that development of the land. And so that was really refreshing to see that, like, all the years and years of planning work that the region has funded and the state has funded, like, that all paid off in dividends, because most stations at this point had station area plans and had political buy-in to do this. So in terms of what happened physically on the ground, one of the big things that happened was when this legislation was going through in 2018, the city of Berkeley, which it was totally taboo. You could not talk about the North Berkeley BART or the Ashby BART parking lots. You just couldn't speak about development of those giant swaths of surface parking. You could not raise it. The mayor and the council member representing North Berkeley and Rebecca Saltzman, who's our board member for that area, were doing some outreach that year, and we're discovering that the majority of people they talked to actually were really interested in seeing housing at the North Berkeley BART station. And then that coupled with this state law, I mean, it felt like it just turned on a dime overnight, where you weren't even allowed to discuss it, to like, how can we get it done as fast as possible? Okay, so that was 2018, and we're here 5 years later. It took us a while. We did a lot of planning and engagement efforts. Some might say I think we over-engaged. I think people got pretty tired at the end there. But we have a developer team for that. We've got a project that's about 750 housing units, about 50% affordable. And here we sit on the cusp of this development that's going to be using this AB 2923. So then all told, along the Richmond line, we actually are pursuing development at 3 stations all at once and could be building upwards of 2,200 housing units on a single rail corridor. So it's pretty wild.
Yeah. And then MacArthur had some development.
Yeah. MacArthur too. Yeah. MacArthur had been originally planned for a couple of mid-rise housing projects. But the city of Oakland, when they were going through the entitlements process with the developer, they did put in an alternative that included a high-rise. And lo and behold, suddenly the market worked for high-rise. At the time that they put that alternative in, nobody ever thought that MacArthur, which is a station at the very core of BART's system, probably has like 3 or 4 minute headways given, in any direction because there are so many trains that converge. Nobody thought that a high-rise was going to work there, and then it did. And so BART has its first high-rise at the MacArthur station, 25 stories. So I think there's 885 units at MacArthur all told.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
It's a big building, and it kind of it makes a statement when you're riding the train and you're coming around the corner and you're like, oh, that's a big building. And that's something that, you see in these pictures of other cities, like we always talked about the Ballston corridor, right?
Yeah.
In DC, and you see this kind of string of pearls of density, but it's interesting to see it here.
And Grace Kreniken, our former general manager, when she came to BART, she told my predecessor, Jeff Ordway, that she wanted to be able to fly into the Bay Area and tell where the BART stations were just by flying in. And she's getting her wish.
Yeah, it's pretty cool.
Yeah.
How have the policy and guidelines aged in that time period, too? I mean, are there things that you wish were different, or are there things that are being tweaked as we speak? What's the process like?
Yeah, I think the biggest tension for us has been that I think we have developed a reputation in California that we are very supportive of housing and of affordable housing in particular. But unfortunately, I think a lot of developers assume that means we're going to give our land away for free. And so, of course, one of the other big things that's changed over the last couple of years has been that BART's ridership is, down to less than half of what it was before COVID. And we really heavily relied on fares for the operating budget. So we had this tension of, wanting to support affordable housing, wanting to do everything we could, but also having a serious budget crisis. And, we talk at BART, we talk about the fiscal cliff that, come 2024, the end of 24 or early 25, we won't have any money to run BART. And so for our real estate department to be negotiating these deals where a developer's coming to us and saying, hey, you can take no ground lease revenue, the optics of that don't work for us right now, even though on the one hand, we're supporting affordable housing, and that's great, and that's so needed. But, a lot of people say, well, BART's a transit agency. BART should be running trains. Why are you bothering to focus on housing at all? And so we did in 2020, we brought an amendment to the policy to draw a line around financial return and make it clear to everybody that we were willing to give a 30% discount from fair market value, but no more than that. And that to meet that, you had to meet certain criteria around, you have to have at least 35% affordable housing, and it has to be a pretty, deep level of affordable housing. So that's been the number one kind of tension for us that we really did have to go back into the policy and revisit because we were so successful at raising the visibility of what we do.
Yeah. Do you expect in the future at some point that those revenues will contribute significantly to BART's budget?
It depends on how you look at things. Obviously, BART's budget is, I think it's a $2 billion budget, right? So in the scheme of things, how much difference is ground lease revenue going to make? But what BART has always been about, and the reason BART has had this program for, upwards of 30 years, has been about ridership. And so we've done a lot of analysis and modeling and surveying to understand, do people who live at BART stations or work at BART stations actually take BART more? Because they're buying tickets, they're contributing fares, and that's the core of our revenue source right now. And so when we are modeling what we're going to bring in, if you look at just the ground lease revenue, and our ground lease revenue is pretty suppressed because for years and years, BART was replacing parking. And so $80 million of our land value was infused into building new parking garages at these projects. And, we're just not going to do that anymore. We can't afford to do that anymore. Mm-hmm. But we were able to retain and increase, just really give our ridership a big boost by doing that. So if you look at just the ground lease revenue, we're only bringing in about $2 million a year. But, $80 million of our value went into garages. But if you look at our ridership revenue, just the riders coming out of those projects, it's in the, 10s, 20s, 30s of millions of dollars per year. So it's a very different picture.
It's a double bonus, really, because you get both the value out of the land and then you get the value from the ridership as well.
Yeah, and that was always the intention. But I think where we do have more work to do post-COVID is understanding if that ridership differential that like people who live near BART are, 2 or 3 times more likely to take BART, like is that sticking? And most of our projects now have very low, if any, parking. So people don't have a choice, right? They're going to leave their house. They're going to have to get on some kind of transit or get on a bike or walk. And so one of the things we really need to do is do some new survey work to figure out if it's true that our TODs are still outnumbering and outperforming everything around them.
Yeah. So there's such a huge amount of people that are involved in BART projects. And I think Hillary calls this a partner stack to go with a capital stack, right? There's so many people that are working on these things. What do each of these different entities that you work with to build projects, what do they bring to the table?
It is a partner stack. I really like that. It is so many partners. I mean, the developer and getting the right developer is everything. Getting somebody who knows how to build that energy and that momentum and that interest is critical because, an affordable housing developer, no matter whether you're near transit or not, you were looking at a dozen sources of funds, right? But when you're building affordable housing at a transit station, you're looking at probably twice that because you're also having to replace parking or rebuild your bus intermodal or add your, new bike lanes, make street improvements, add more bike parking. There's so many transportation-based functions. So now, and I think this is especially true in California because California has adopted cap and trade policies, the transportation dollars are flowing to these TOD projects almost as much, or if not just as much, as the housing dollars. So you're having to bring those transportation partners to the table. Sometimes the developer is eligible for funding. Sometimes the city is eligible for funding. Sometimes BART is eligible for funding. So the funding's coming in the door in all the different doors. And then you have to figure out how you're gluing it all together to make this project happen. And who's spending it? And then, of course, the community and having community champions is just everything. I mean, we would not be where we are today in Berkeley if not for the mayor, for Jesse Arreguín. We would not be where we are. And with our board members as well. But having those champions who, even through the hard times, because there are hard times, see that vision through.
Yeah. What are the stages of development for a typical BART project?
So we have kind of the pre-solicitation stage at BART where we're establishing what our goals and objectives are for the project. Then we go through the solicitation where we're selecting the developer. The developer, really is leading on, the entitling, designing, funding, financing stage. And for BART, that means both helping them with pre-development and with design review, and then moving through the entitlements and into the heavy-duty legal negotiations is it a lease option? For us, it's always a lease option, but lease or sale, what is the transaction into construction and then beyond?
Yeah. I feel like some people would expect okay, you're going to build a project, just do it. It's going to pop out of the ground and be easily recognizable as a development project. But it's a lot more work, obviously, than that. And there's so many details that go along with it.
There's so much technical work that is going into it. And, some of our projects like MacArthur, Fruitvale, Walnut Creek, these are projects that have taken upwards of 20 years to come out of the ground. We can't wait 20 years. So we've been trying to find ways to shorten that process. And I'd say we have it down to probably 5 to 7 years, which, still Rebecca Saltzman, who is our Berkeley representative, is 5 is too long. 5 is too long. You got to get it down to 2. But, it is so much work. Getting that entitlement package together is so much work. And BART is in its design review, looking at things that you would never think to look at. I mean, right, we're looking at access and circulation on the site. We're looking at how are the maintenance vehicles going to come into the property? Where are the station agents going to park when they open up the doors at 4 a.m.? What's going on structurally under the ground? And then, oh, by the way, we were built 50 years ago. So there's all kinds of weird conduit and storm water things that happen in most of our property that we have to untangle and undo. Like at Fruitvale, the conduit that was powering the station was also powering the lights in the parking lot. And so when they took the lights out, had we not been watching, they would have cut power to the station, which would have been terrible. So I think nowadays people don't have to worry about those things. But we have a lot of old stuff we have to watch for.
You also have to think about like who's developing the projects, right? And the developers and the folks that think about that. And you all were recently awarded $3.5 million from the state to create a loan fund.
Yes.
How is that going to be used, and what exactly does that mean for future projects?
Yeah, this is something that I think a couple of different agencies have been, I would say, discovering and focusing on this pre-development hurdle. And Sound Transit has been doing this with Amazon, and MARTA, has been working on creating a fund, I think, with Morgan Stanley, if I'm not mistaken. And, for us, what we realized, this was working with eBaldsey. Most of our affordable housing projects, most of our projects have been with larger scale developers. And they have different ways of financing their pre-development work because, that is a really tough place to be. Like, you're basically running the project along on fumes till you get to construction because you're just trying to get your entitlements done and get all your construction loans. But one of the barriers we've realized, because we do only ground lease our land, is that if a private developer owns a private piece of land, they can use that land as collateral to get a big loan to do all this work. Our land cannot be used as collateral because they don't control it. So we were realizing that the amount of loans that eBaldsey, as a smaller developer who didn't have these other deep capital sources to go to for this pre-development stage, they were only able to secure small pre-development loans under $1 million. And, by my estimate, keep in mind, our projects are enormous, right? We're talking, 500 to 1,000 units, multi-phase projects, right? So it's a lot of work and a lot more expense and time. And so that costs money. And I think our latest estimate was it can cost upwards of $5 to $7 million to get that done. But if we're working with community-based developers, if we're working with smaller scale market rate developers, if we want to work with Black-led developers who are a community-based developer, who are for-profit, there are so many different partners in the development community who can do amazing work, but they don't have the same resources to pull. So with the loan, the grant we received from the state, this program REAP 2.0, the idea is that BART would be able to help fill that pre-development loan gap. So we're going to provide a loan to eBaldsey to get them over the finish line for the Lake Merritt project. And it will be a revolving loan. I've always envisioned we would create a revolving loan fund where we do a capital stack, we do something bigger, similar to TOA, but the amount of money that we have to work with is just not big enough to do that. But it is enough to get us a revolving loan. And then eBaldsey, when they enter construction, will pay that back. And then BART will be able to churn that out into other projects. So it enables us to lower the barrier to developing our enormous projects.
TOA, what's the acronym there?
Transit-Oriented Affordable Housing Fund. Yes.
I mean, it's so interesting because I'm hoping that it's something that, like you said, creates a revolving fund that perpetuates itself, right? That keeps going in the future. And so you have the seed money and you can actually do this for a long period of time. And then they pay you back, right? Like that. Yeah. They take the loan out. They can do the pre-development stuff, but then they can get you back later. And then that money goes back into the fund again. So you can just keep on using it over and over again. It's not just a one-time thing. It feels like a perpetual motion machine, as close as you can get to it.
That's the hope. But now BART has to figure out how to loan money. Because, yet again, BART's not in that field either, right? So we loan money to ourselves for things, but how do we loan money to a third party? And how do we make this all work? So we definitely have some uncharted territory we're about to enter.
There's work going on trying to figure that out?
Yeah, we're trying to untangle that right now.
Switching gears a little bit, I'm wondering, we try to have TOD solve a lot of problems, and we've talked about this a lot, right? Like we try to have it solve our transportation problem. We try to have it solve our affordable housing problem. We try to have it fix our parking issues sometimes. I'm wondering what the priorities are specifically for TOD, for BART, for maybe the agencies in the Bay Area, because we do ask a lot of development near transit.
We do ask a lot for development near transit, but we also give a lot of resources to development near transit, at least in California. That is a good question. For BART, number one is ridership. Always has been, probably always will be. And I don't really think that's an issue because if you build a 75 unit to the acre project, you've already well more than replaced that one parking space. Like this is the math we've actually done to figure out what is the minimum density we would need to actually get net gains in ridership. We will never build a project that's not achieving net gains. Number two is probably equity and affordable housing, for sure. And that's just the nature of the region we serve and what its needs are. And doing this, BART has a lot of issues, quality of life issues in our system that are the result of our homelessness rates. So it's all connected.
Yeah.
As you like to say.
as I say fairly frequently on long walks to sandwich shops. Is the real estate team involved in like station area planning for future stations and for future, I mean, we have this huge Link 21 program that's starting up and starting to think about maybe expansions or the future of the system. I'm wondering how much maybe your team or the group that thinks about real estate thinks about those projects and where stations go or what the station looks like. Obviously, the station designs are something that I've harped on a lot over the years.
Yeah.
But I'm curious, like, how that connects to the work that you all are doing.
Yeah, we are definitely brought in, but Link 21 does of its own staff. And I think it's important that they do this. You know, they have staff embedded in the Link 21 team who are all about development and land use themselves. Not at this stage, it's really more kind of the long-term land use planning, right? We're not to the stage of, oh, okay, which land are we going to acquire for this construction staging and how is that strategically going to be leveraged? We're not there yet, but Link 21 stole one of my favorite and best staff people. So in that way, yes, they're quite embedded with me. So it's core to the way that Link 21 is planning. And the real estate department, you know, particularly because I also oversee the right-of-way side of the house. I oversee all the, you know, anybody touches any piece of BART-owned property, you know, we're involved in some way. And the right-of-way team has a lot of folks who started at BART during the SFO extension days. And so they came to BART specifically to acquire the land for SFO. And it is a very technical skill set, that land acquisition, and it's so heavily regulated that I'm really grateful that we still have that knowledge base from the SFO days, though, you know, maybe we do stuff different today than we did then. But at least you have to start with that technical foundation or else you get down the road with your grand vision and oops, I didn't realize that was a compliance problem. So I'm grateful that they're around to kind of help educate us so we do it right when we get to that acquisition stage.
How do you feel about the next kind of iteration of Fruitvale? Fruitvale has always been talked about. It's one of those, it was in the New Transit Town book originally when Shelley and Hank and those folks wrote it, and everybody else, obviously, there was a big contribution from everybody. But, you know, it was in that book, it was seen as a kind of one of those success stories, and now it's evolving.
Yeah, Fruitvale is a really interesting story, and it has evolved so much. And I think it struggled in the early years. I think the retail in particular really struggled. It was hard to make it pencil. You know, it operated at a loss for many years so that, you know, if you wanted the kind of local business that you wanted there, you weren't going to accept the Starbucks. You were going to accept someone who paid a lot less rent than Starbucks, right? But it feels like actually Fruitvale is... You know, there's a Native American restaurant in the Transit Village now. There's all kinds of cool stuff that's cropping up. And it feels like it's finally hit that point. It's been like 30 years, but it's finally not 30 years. I think it opened in 2004. So maybe 20 years.
Yeah.
But I think it's finally hit the point where stuff is going to organically happen. But one of the interesting struggles that Fruitvale went through was there was always supposed to be a phase 2 to Fruitvale. BART owned 6 acres just to the south of the Fruitvale Transit Village that BART sold to the city of Oakland in 2010. You know, with the height of the recession and everything, there were a couple of different transactions that occurred to save the project. And the Unity Council had always envisioned, and the community had always envisioned, that was going to be market rate housing. And over the course of maybe the last 5 or 10 years, even as recently as 5 years ago, you know, we were still at the height of the housing crisis, but there was always the desire to have some level of market rate housing there as a way of stimulating some additional buying power and encouraging a greater mix of incomes in a community that is, you know, on the lower income level for the Bay Area. And the market would just not come. Like, even though we're in the wealthiest region in the world, like the real estate market would not build market rate housing in Fruitvale. And finally, the Unity Council and its partners kind of gave up on the notion that this would be a mixed income community and ended up building 2 pretty large affordable housing developments there. So Casa Arabella opened a couple years ago, and it's 92 units of housing, most of which are geared towards formerly homeless individuals. And Casa Sueños is about to open, and that's 181 units. It's one of the larger projects. And so I don't know what the future of Fruitvale is going to be. I think it will be really interesting to see when you've got 270 units of affordable housing there and you've got, you know, the Transit Village next door. Like, how is it all going to feel? I don't know.
Yeah. Do you have a favorite station?
Depends on what what do you mean by that? I really do love Lake Merritt. I love Lake Merritt. I love what Lake Merritt I think is going to become. I love that Lake Merritt has a skylight, the graphical art that's in the station, the tiling that's done there, the little Laney College wayfinding mosaic, the weird sunken plaza with there's just all kinds of neat little hidden features at that station.
Yeah, it's a pretty cool one. I'm partial to 24th Street Mission, but that's just because I live close, I think. Do you expect that there'll be a station at Alameda Point?
Oh my gosh, I sure hope so. I'm going to do everything I can to make that happen. I think that Alameda is very excited that I'm coming. I think I kind of wonder if part of the reason they're bringing me over is to send a message to BART that, yeah, we're serious about this. I sure hope so. I'm worried for Link 21. I feel like this is a region that really needs a long-range transportation plan. We're all kind of hanging our hats on Link 21. All the other stuff happened already or is like already well underway, like, you know, the BART line to Santa Clara through downtown San Jose. Like, that's going to happen, right? But where is our long-range plan if we don't have Link 21? And I think we're really caught in this conundrum right now that BART's operating budget is failing and Link 21 is a capital project that, you know, is sitting on a couple $100 million. And I think the region's kind of at a crossroads of like, are we going to continue to think about long-range transit expansion or not? It scares me that we won't.
Yeah, I think I'm worried about it too, because, you know, when we think about 2050, and that's the time frame, we can't just get to 2050 and be like, oh man, I wish we would have planned for that then. And I feel like we've already had so many short-sighted planning exercises, and we've done, we just opened up BRT on Van Ness. We just started talking about BRT on Geary being actually passed, but it's like a watered-down version of the ideas that people had for the last 20, 30 years.
Yeah.
And I don't think we can afford to do that anymore. I feel like we need to have something that is going to get people from one side of the region to the other and connect a larger network of commuter rail and those types of things. So as somebody who, you know, hopes to live in this region for a really long time, I would be upset if we get to 2050 and we don't have anything different than what we have today.
Exactly.
Right?
And we're still growing. We're still spreading and growing. And it's not like population growth has stopped in the Bay Area. And what if we'd done that with BART in the 60s?
Yeah. Yeah. And it's really frustrating. I mean, imagine if we didn't have BART, like what kind of messed up thing we'd be trying to do now. So yeah, I'm scared, but it's there and it's plugging along. So what do you hope for in the future for BART?
I hope BART can find a permanent source of funding. I think it's on everybody's, you know, it's the elephant in the room, right? And it's the number one problem. We have to find a permanent source of funding to sustain us, which BART's not going to the ballot till 2026. And if we're not successful, what happens? It's hard to think beyond that when that's just kind of the reality you're staring down. It's hard, you know, when you're in that dire situation, how do you think about the long range plan? How do you think about the doing the nicer thing? And I think that's really the struggle that we're all going through right now is everyone wants to be thinking about the big picture of TOD, but TOD without the transit is just odd.
That's a good way to end the show.
We've taken it too far, Jeff.
We've taken it too far. We got too far. Thanks for joining us on the show. We really appreciate your time, and I'm looking forward to seeing what you're doing in Alameda.
Thank you, Jeff.
And thanks for joining us. The Talking Headways podcast is a project of the Overhead Wire and published first at Streetsblog USA. Thanks to our generous Patreon supporters for supporting this week's podcast, and you can find out more at patreon.com/theoverheadwire. And sign up for our 17-year-old newsletter by visiting theoverheadwire.com. To get the show each week, follow along at your podcatcher of choice, including Spotify, SoundCloud, iHeartRadio, YouTube, TuneIn, Apple Podcasts, and many, many more. And if you can't find it there, you can always find its original home at usa.streetsblog.org. We'll see you next time at Talking Headways.